Greetings friends, welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko. Today, as usual, we have the After the War podcast, which I host together with my comrade Taras BEREZOVETS. And as usual, today we are live. We've decided to add a bit of interactivity so that you too can share your thoughts in the chat, which I encourage you to do. Write what you think. I understand that the topic we're discussing today, Turkey, Istanbul, and the possible negotiations there, their outcomes, who will come, who will speak, what statements will be made, and who will show courage, is a significant one. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky is already demonstrating that courage. He has clearly stated that he will come. There are already members of our delegation, as far as I understand, in Turkey. So write your impressions and thoughts. Do you think this meeting will be a breakthrough in terms of establishing a ceasefire, a silence regime, at the very least? I'm not even talking about negotiating peace, because obviously at this stage that would be premature. And before we begin, before I announce the positions of the parties, although you probably already know them, let me ask Taras, what do you think? Will Putin come to the meeting in Istanbul himself, or will he send someone else? And if so, who?
Yesterday, I would have said with 100% certainty, no. Today, I would cautiously say there's a 99.9% chance he won't come. But there is a very small, tiny chance that he might still show up. Why? Because Donald Trump might be there. And right now, it is very disadvantageous for Putin to completely break off relations with the American president, especially to turn him against himself. At the moment, he is nearby in the Middle East. Today, he is visiting the countries of the Dardanelles Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, and he will be here until Friday. And he has already said that he can fly in at any moment. So I don't rule out the possibility that purely situationally, since Putin is a political animal with predatory instincts, he might sense danger for himself, and that's why he could fly in. But the chances of that are very small.
And what is the danger? I'm always trying to understand why Russia should now agree to a ceasefire, except perhaps because of the situation on the battlefield or out of desire. We have the desire, yes. Ukraine is constructive and consistent. There was a proposal from the United States in March that a ceasefire should be reached. Ukraine agrees. For 2 months now, Russia, Putin has been dodging this in every way possible. They are stalling for time. They manipulate, constantly putting forward some conditions. And now again, these are not unconditional negotiations. Putin lied again. Because if you look at his entourage making statements, like Ushakov, for example, or Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, I understand that they don't actually decide anything. In Russia, only what Putin says matters. But at the same time, they mentioned that Ushakov said there should be a meeting in Istanbul, supposedly based on what was agreed upon in March 2022, and that negotiations should start from those positions. That is things like some kind of demilitarization, no joining NATO, but taking into account the realities on the ground. That is where Russian troops are currently located. So they are already putting forward conditions, and this is also one of Putin's lies. And the question is, why should Putin meet with Trump? To discuss the so-called root causes, or under the threat that sanctions might be imposed, for example, by the Senate?
Well, first of all, unlike Zelensky, who has already met with Trump twice in person, once at the Vatican and once at the White House since being elected president, and who also met with him when Trump was still a presidential candidate, Putin has not seen him since 2017. The last time they met was at the summit in Helsinki. And so, even from this rather banal point of view, that Putin, after all, is a lieutenant colonel of the KGB, and in working with, let's say, other parties, he needs personal contact. Among other things, he understands that contact through phone calls or video communication does not solve all the tasks. In order to keep a particular person under control, and he undoubtedly strives to keep everyone under control, both his friends and even more so his enemies, he needs a personal meeting. And he looks at whether things are going badly for Zelensky or not. Yes, their relationship with Trump is complicated, but they still communicate. There is communication nonetheless. Communication is a sign of a healthy relationship. With Macron, I don't even know how many times Zelensky has met with him since 2022, probably 15 or 20 times, most likely.
The president of Ukraine calls almost every day.
But here, well, the situation is such that there is no contact. And even from this point of view, he needs it. Besides, Erdogan is waiting for him. Erdogan is extremely influential and powerful. And there is one more important thing. He is now the key player when it comes to Syria. Syria is a country that Putin has essentially lost for himself after Assad's fall. but he still hopes to at least get a foot in the door there. He needs to maintain a presence there in one form or another. The main goal is ultimately, essentially, to maintain control over the two military bases he controlled, specifically in particular Khmeimim, the air base located in Syria, and Tartus, the naval base. And that's why he thinks, we've seen reports that they have started building a new port on the Red Sea. They're hedging their bets in Sudan, but it was attacked by unknown drones belonging to some unidentified local freedom fighters. So for him, that's a very bad sign, and he needs a presence in this region. That's why when key figures for him gather and make agreements without him, it's obviously a bad situation for him. Well, of course, neither Trump nor Zelensky nor Erdogan will meet with Lavrov. That's not the right level of representation. And that's why I say I leave a small probability that after all, he might still decide to forget about everything and just fly there.
And surprise everyone. To create such an information event like, look, I came.
You see, everyone was waiting and waiting.
But the question is, okay, he'll meet with Trump. Will he meet with Zelensky?
I think so. He will definitely meet with him. Trump insists on it.
But then I have some questions. Because when there is the highest level of representation, it is assumed that some decision can be finalized. And we also understand that the decision to cease fire can only be made by Putin. That's obvious, and everyone understands that. The question is whether he is creating a trap for himself. Because if he flies there, it means he is ready to make some kind of decision. Why hold an introductory meeting? Or in what way?
It's not an introductory meeting.
So what are the draft decisions?
Let's call it a recruitment meeting. He wants to...
Who will recruit whom?
Putin will try to recruit Trump again. He will try to recruit Erdogan.
Again? So he's already tried to recruit him before.
He's already tried him. He's tried to recruit all American presidents. Why are we embarrassed by the word recruit? Because for George W. Bush, he made up a story that when his dacha caught fire, the only thing that survived was a little cross. In other words, they invented this story for him, knowing how religious George W. Bush was. That's it. This is already, the sixth American president during Putin's time, I think. The first was Bill Clinton. And with each one, he tried to sell them something of his own, you know? And look, now his allies have started to put pressure on him. Today, Lula announced that he would like...
That's the president of Brazil, for those who don't know.
He wants Putin to meet with Zelensky in Istanbul. So this isn't just Lula's position anymore. Lula is voicing the opinion of the Global South. And BRICS, of course, is an organization where Brazil is a founding country along with Russia. And we still don't fully know the content of Xi's conversations with Putin when he visited. Back then, I suggested that Xi would try to persuade Putin to negotiate after all.
But why?
It's beneficial for him. And look at what happened right after that. When you look at the situation linearly, try looking at it three-dimensionally. Let's turn this situation around.
Yes.
And let's look at the fact that right after Xi flew to Moscow, the Chinese reached an agreement with the Americans and simultaneously reduced mutual tariffs by 115% for the next 90 days. So they have a track of agreements. There was quite a scandal there. They couldn't agree on anything.
Well, okay, they've already reached an agreement, they've already agreed, but the war is still going on. So if they manage to agree without Putin agreeing to a ceasefire...
That's beneficial. This is beneficial for China. China now wants to stop this war because its own interests are suffering from it, primarily its economic interests. China is facing a difficult economic situation, a tough one. There is a high level of youth unemployment, and they want to avoid a recession. That is, the fact that Putin has economic problems is, of course, nothing compared to China's. But the scale of the economies is different, you know?
But okay, I don't quite agree here, because for China, a Russia that is always dependent on China is beneficial. Because if Russia is independent from China, they don't get cheap energy resources, that's one thing, and they don't get cheap raw materials, that's another. If China lets Russia go and Russia takes a peaceful path, let's even imagine such a fantastic scenario, that Russia decides to agree to negotiations. They go for it, and the prospect is still there. Why did Dmitry, Putin's special representative, fly to the United States of America and before that give an interview to the newspaper Izvestia and then talk about it on Fox News in America? He said this: "We want investment in our rare earth metals. We want investment so that American companies will come. But if American companies are going to come in the future, how will they share the market and influence with the Chinese?" That's the first thing. And secondly, if China has already gotten what it needs economically in terms of tariffs without Russia stopping the war, then why would they push for Russia to end the war? That's what I actually don't understand.
Because the Russians now find themselves not only in a difficult situation, now additional sanctions will be imposed, the 17th package of sanctions from the European Union. Britain has imposed sanctions against Russia's shadow fleet, because cheap Russian oil is not only needed by the Russian budget, it's also needed by China, you see. And China understands that if all Russian vessels are moved to the blacklist of the so-called shadow fleet, then China will be left without cheap Russian oil. Accordingly, the cost of products manufactured by China will rise, and this will worsen its competitiveness in the market. And that's why it is in China's interest for this whole situation to at least come to a halt. China can, let's say, demand from Putin to at least stop this situation, to cease fire for a while in order to give a chance for peace negotiations. Once again, I repeat, at the core of China's interest lies pure economics. There's no need to look for geopolitics or humanitarian motives there.
Well, materialism.
Materialism.
Materialism, Marxism.
Because they're Bolsheviks.
Yes. Well, not exactly.
Well, okay, they're red, fine, they're red.
The flag is red.
Red.
The sun is red, don't get too close.
At least according to their views, yes, their views. Although their economy is not red at all. And it's not even a NEP economy. It's fundamentally a purely predatory capitalist economy.
Well, by the way, since you mentioned sanctions, there are two positions. I'll read them out right now. The first position was expressed in the German publication, the newspaper Handelsblatt. It states, citing a European official from Brussels, a diplomat, that the European Union has practically exhausted its options for sanction pressure against Russia. They mentioned this and said they do not see prospects for further expansion. And how can these sanctions have any effect? I'll give an example now, by the way, because the ambassadors of the European Union have just agreed on the 17th package of sanctions. This was announced by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. So, what is this about? This is a direct statement, and quote from Ursula von der Leyen on the social network X. We are further restricting access to technologies for the battlefield. We have added another 189 Shadow Fleet vessels to the list to target Russian energy exports. This war must end. We will continue to exert strong pressure on the Kremlin. The sanctions are expected to be finally adopted during the EU Foreign Affairs Council meeting on May 20th. Earlier, the US President's Special Representative for Ukraine, General Keith Kellogg, stated that Congress has already prepared a draft for new sanctions against Russia. It has been supported by more than 70 senators. As I understand it, this refers specifically to the bill proposed by Senator Lindsey Graham, which envisions 500% tariffs on those who purchase oil, gas, uranium, and other minerals from Russia, that is, including measures against China as well. So it seems to me that the problem right now is that over the past week we haven't heard of any progress or information about when this package will be implemented. It is being discussed in Ukraine. We are urging for this to be done. Both the President and the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine have mentioned this in their interviews. And that's the right thing to do. But it seems to me that the United States at this moment is lacking that leadership to tell the Europeans, we are going to push hard on the issue of sanctions right now. It's already in the Senate, it's right here. And this could have an impact because without the United States, it's impossible to apply all this pressure, including involving China, the global south, and everyone else. For example, Brazil is buying diesel, I think, from Russia. They're buying something on a large scale, if we mention Lula. Without the US, without American leadership, it will be difficult. So what is the position here? Donald Trump has given Putin a little more time. What happens next? So if Putin doesn't go on the 15th, if there is no breakthrough, if there is no ceasefire that was supposed to happen on May 12th, right now it's the 14th, and, well, let's say last night there was a large number of Shaheds. The enemy is attacking on the front line. Moreover, the Financial Times, citing Ukrainian intelligence, reports that the enemy is preparing for more active offensive action, specifically in the Donetsk direction. So for now, I don't see, let's say, what I find lacking when I talk about courage and activity is a certain decisiveness. How much more time are they willing to give Putin?
I think they can give him quite a long time, but sooner or later that time will still come to an end. Why? Because Donald Trump himself, as well as through his advisors, has warned that he is considering the possibility of simply walking away from these negotiations if nothing works out. Notice how genuinely pleased he was when the military conflict between India and Pakistan was curtailed. He immediately declared that this was his personal achievement. Here, we'll set aside the question of how much credit his administration actually deserves. He said, look, I told you, if I were president, there would be no wars happening in the world. And this war between Ukraine and Russia would never have happened if I had been president of the United States. He made this statement, and by the way, repeated it during an online meeting attended by Mohammed bin Salman, Erdogan, and Ash-Shara, the interim president of Syria. So for him, this is something that really triggers him. This topic is very important to him. He wants to prove to himself, his allies, and especially his rivals, that he is capable of solving such global problems. That's why he is willing to give, in his view, enough time and opportunities for Putin to agree to these negotiations. But if he believes that the chance is lost, I don't think he will stop, because Trump is known for moving, so to speak, like the Manhattan Express. In other words, if there's a chance and it's over, he's already on his way. That is, he can't stop after that.
By the way, let me say something about Trump now. You mentioned Saudi Arabia and the meeting. So the agreement between the USA and Saudi Arabia regarding arms sales has been called historic and will be implemented over the course of years. Trump reached an agreement with Saudi Arabia. $142 billion is the total amount for which Saudi Arabia plans to purchase weapons, aviation, air defense systems, and missile defense systems. And most likely, I think that Riyadh is planning to become the leader in the region. Although I would say, it still depends on what type of war we're talking about.
Think about it differently. You as a military man, now already a serviceman, tell me, why does Saudi Arabia need such power, such strong weaponry?
I'll tell you right now. With Iran, first and foremost. And there's really no one else in the region Turkey. Relations there aren't very simple either, not simple in every aspect. Turkey is now fighting for leadership in Syria, for example. For example, Turkish President Erdogan immediately said, "We will protect Damascus, important sites. We will deploy air defense systems." He actually got involved, and he had a conflict with Israel over this. By the way, Israel, there was a recent statement by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, who said that perhaps we will have to stop relying on American assistance. This, by the way, is a signal for Ukraine because these things are directly connected. The issue of aid to Israel and Ukraine, I want to remind you, was bundled together during the vote in Congress back in 2024. Well, yes, Biden did it that way because otherwise the decision might not have passed. And now I don't know how they will separate them. But as for Saudi Arabia with 142 billion, I just want to remind you that right now Trump is fighting the Yemeni Houthis. In Yemen, American troops, the so-called coalition forces, are carrying out strikes directly on targets in Yemen. But Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates conducted a ground operation in Yemen a few years ago, and they failed to defeat the Houthis, even though they used Abrams tanks. They used a large amount of equipment. So what kind of war, depending on the situation, are they preparing for? And against whom? Clearly not against the Houthis, but against something bigger. You mentioned over there Pakistan as well. According to media reports, Turkey was actively helping Pakistan. Saudi Arabia could also have been conducting so it's actually quite interesting. But as for Trump, I can say that, he's really moving forward like an express train, as some have described it, moving very quickly and decisively. However, there is a statement that was made by Trump's special representative, Steve Witkoff, who stated that the United States may potentially withdraw from the ongoing negotiation process if nothing significant is ultimately achieved during these important and ongoing discussions. By the way, I think they might withdraw even if something is achieved, because they'll say that Ukraine is holding direct negotiations with Russia. Let them work it out themselves. And we'll just stand aside, watch, and then...
I don't think he's ready to let go of these negotiations. Otherwise, he won't be able to take credit for the success of this negotiation story. I don't think he'll agree to that.
Well, I wouldn't rule it out. And yes, in any case, take the India-Pakistan case. The US wasn't an active mediator, but he still said it was his achievement. He'll say it's his achievement here too. He'll still say, we did everything for this. And in the end, they reached an agreement.
After all, he wants to get, everyone thinks so, the Nobel Peace Prize for this story. He really wants this. And in order to be considered for it, he understands that you can't convince the Nobel Committee with words alone. Concrete actions are needed. That's why I think he won't let go of this story. He'll keep threatening to withdraw. But nevertheless, look, he's sending a very strong team to Istanbul in any case. It will be headed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is now also, at the same time, the National Security Advisor. He holds two positions. In history, only Henry Kissinger once managed to combine two such posts. He's sending Steve Witkoff, the Special Representative for Middle Eastern Affairs, and now also retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. He is also an important member of the team who, by the way, played a significant role. He had certain doubts about Kellogg. But as we can see, lately he has returned. He has indeed come back into Trump's inner circle and is starting to play a bigger and bigger role. The main question here is what the outcome of these negotiations will be. If Lavrov comes there, if he is again shaken up there, he will meet, of course, not with the president or Zelensky, but with the head of the Ukrainian delegation, depending on who will lead it. And that's it. And then it will be clear that there won't be any agreements on a ceasefire or the start of peace talks. It will just be another drawn-out process, like when they rolled out their conditions in Istanbul in 2022. And it will all end up with nothing. And then the question is, how will Trump react? How will the Europeans react? Will they just silently watch and once again give Putin a chance? Or will they immediately move on to Plan B? That's the question.
The thing is, when it comes to Plan B, unfortunately, I'm somewhat pessimistic here, because without the United States, the Europeans won't be able to implement it on their own. With all their signs and signals, they're showing that America is important. Even the meeting of the coalition of the willing on May 10th in Kyiv, a historic visit, with European leaders actually coming and holding discussions. But what are they actually doing? They call President Trump and say, yes, Ukraine once again emphasizes that we are ready to agree to a 30-day ceasefire.
Yes, yes.
What's next?
Next?
If this doesn't happen without American leadership, I think it will be difficult for the Europeans. Well, ultimately, we have to understand that if the Americans were the first to impose sanctions on the likes of Orban or Fico, it would send a signal that going against America, getting into confrontation, and claiming to support some pro-Russian initiative is not worth it. Because after all, the Americans are the ones taking the lead. And it seems to me, unfortunately, that the way these negotiations started in general from the very beginning, they were conducted in such a way that there were supposedly certain boundaries that the US was ready to compromise on. In other words, the possible lifting of sanctions, as reported by the media. Then, in general, the lifting of sanctions that were imposed starting from 2014 against Putin and Russia for the annexation of Crimea and so on. So there are questions. Well, meanwhile, by the way, here's Peskov. Once again, there's his comment for Arya Novosti again over the phone. That's just his usual manner. So without any video connection, he said that the negotiations remain relevant. The Russian delegation will be waiting for the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul on Thursday, and Putin has several phone calls scheduled. The Kremlin will inform if contacts between Putin and Brazilian President Lula da Silva are agreed upon. In other words, they're keeping the intrigue going until the very end. Well, I think that's really their style. The way things are happening, the way they operate, it's actually quite interesting. And you, friends, by the way, those of you who are currently watching us live, please, if you have a moment, kindly write in the chat below what you personally think, how you believe this will end, and what might possibly happen next, honestly, in your own opinion. We truly value and appreciate your thoughts and feedback. By the way, we have just now received another comment, a fresh, new comment, just moments ago, literally, for RBC Ukraine.